Now, the first issue is the following. As judge, I welcome you. Unlike many juries, you're not to receive any compensation for your time, but similarly, neither are you to be asked questions about your political leanings or opinions in this case. You are asked to be neutral at the start and come to your conclusions at the end. You're to be asked about the United Nations relevance and whether it is to continue in its current form and place. As I've mentioned, this is a requirement that you participate at least passively by listening and forming an opinion, because at the end, you all are required to vote. So please read all these opening statements carefully, and we will proceed on that basis. Now, arguments for the dissolution. It's too expensive. Does not meet its own stated goals. Threatens state sovereignty, and I've provided links, if needed, to specific articles within the United Nations Charter, or is listed as a slide number in this presentation. There are indeed heavy costs borne by the city and state of New York. The property is of immense value for further development, such as residence and offices, which would accrue taxes to the city and state of New York. Many of the so-called international activities may be managed through other venues, and we'll come to that in a little bit later in this presentation that details some of the organization of the United Nations itself, but which many people are not aware of, actually partners with a lot of independent agencies, but through that partnership accrue a fair degree of authority and force in their recommendations. Therefore, it's expanded its authority beyond what its charter initially outlined. It has also become extraordinarily political, and the Security Council itself, by its very structure, perverts and obstructs the ability of the United Nations to carry out its stated goals. Most fundamentally, and again, something most people fail to grasp fully, is that it is composed of unelected officials. There is no participation of the general global population in deciding what the United Nations does. That is left to the authority of what, as a plaintiff, counsel is saying, are unelected elites. Now, to buttress that argument, we have the following points. The UN is all talk, no action. Enforcement is weak. There is enormous inefficiency in the administration with many overlapping agencies. Therefore, it's mired in policy disputes within itself rather than being able to act and force actions. There are many inconsistencies in its views of human rights. And if you look back through who has been in charge of human rights councils within the UN, you'll find some rather enlightening exceptions, such as Iran or other countries which do not pay much attention to human rights. Allowing countries with poor human rights records is set here, and we have enormous amounts of corruption and mismanagement within the organization. oil for food program in Iraq being one example, misappropriation of funds, lack of financial transparency. Among the charges the plaintiffs laid against the UN is the challenge to state sovereignty. And then moral relativism and symbolic gestures, which have very little to do with actually accomplishing anything except distort moral principles that are usually reserved to sovereign nations themselves, rather than impose one from an elite organization. The concentration of power in the Security Council goes beyond what one should respect. The 5 permanent members holding veto power. Any single country can block action, even in egregious problems such as genocide and major conflicts. It entrenches specifically post-World War II power structures. So even though the Security Council has expanded, the 5 permanent members remain in utter control. The non-permanent members have a voice, but this is not a matter of majority decision on action. That the UN has egregiously failed to prevent wars and conflicts, and its own peacekeeping missions are underfunded, poorly equipped, and constrained by political disagreements. Now, just as quick examples, General Assembly has condemned Israel 140 times since 2015, more than all others combined. And in 2023, as often as all other countries. Now remember, this is the plaintiff approach. You pick your side according to what you feel the facts reveal. Since 2022, the Security Council has maintained sanctions on the countries that you see lifted, with targeted measures on individual entities, but no new countrywide sanctions have been added since 2022. Now think of what the world has been through in the last 3+ years, and it'll give you some insights into whether or not the UN is still relevant. Various measures, understandably, are present, as you'll see under types of measures, and you'll see that there's been a focus to use targeted sanctions rather than countrywide to minimize the humanitarian impact. Now consider what that means as the plaintiff. That means that you're trying to parse out individual responsibility versus state sovereignty. And how do you manage that? Can you actually do it? The answer to the plaintiffs is it is utterly impossible. As we saw, again, as the plaintiff argument, that when humanitarian aid was brought into Gaza, there were numerous circumstances, and the same has occurred in Somalia, where various warlords captured convoys, took all the supplies, and used them to their own ends, not for the humanitarian goals with which they were sent. So in that regard, the UN has failed to protect those convoys and see that the goods therein are distributed properly for the humanitarian measures so outlined. Now the defense will raise these points. All states, all countries are given a forum in which they can present their grievances and seek resolution without resorting to war. Certain policies are standardized and disseminated among all the members, which provides for a coherent response to conflicts. And these are outlined in the articles that I've mentioned in the Charter 24 to 26, 39 to 47. Certain cultural issues are protected and designated and have become the requirement of the state in which those cultural icons are residing to be protected from destruction. Now, we all may remember the statuary that was taken down, blown up a number of years back. Trying to remember the name, begins with a B. The point is that obviously if a sovereign state is not able to do that, think of Syria now with its civil war and how difficult it is to protect points of culture and heritage that are important to the rest of the world. Only the United Nations can really deal with that. No other nation independently can do it. The recommendations developed by its varied departments and surrogates, such as WHO, which is a surrogate, it's not actually part of the United Nations, can draw policies which are to influence global reaction to health issues. No other organization exists which can do that. Now, as a side note, if you look me up on Substack, I've written about the WHO and some recommendations the past administration was offering. One of which was that if the WHO determines there is a pandemic, that those nations which have signed on to the WHO will commit 5% of their GDP to addressing the pandemic. So think about that in terms of obligation. The United Nations provides peacekeeping forces which do limit conflicts, and I have examples of how they've done that. The cost borne by the participating nations is based on wealth, not on population, not on geography. In fact, for those of us in the United States who complain that the United States allegedly pays 22% of the NATO budget, the UN budget, without a cap that was put on, according to the wealth of the United States, we would be obligated to pay 25%. So we save 3% because we required a cap. Costs are allocated as mentioned. The other extreme action the United Nations can take is to actually create an armed force under the United Nations authority, which can participate in war. The most obvious example is the Korean conflict. But there are also some elements of the UN that were involved in the first Gulf War. The UN contributes mightily, and I'll show this in a moment, to New York City's economy. And the United Nations, through its various departments, constructs what it calls best practice, which can be disseminated widely through its agencies to assist developing nations. And then finally, the location was actually established by treaty, not through the UN Charter. So there's a different format that has to be looked at if the United Nations location is to be moved. It has 42,830 staff with an additional 100,000 personnel. And it contributes $4+ billion to the New York City economy through various means. such as its hospitality and tourism, real estate, and although the UN headquarters and official missions are exempt from New York City property taxes, there still are hidden fees which are paid that contribute to that 4+ billion in New York City's economy. The complex itself is valued at 2 to 3 billion, and the diplomatic properties around it include a broader array that also adds value in the billions. As to peacekeeping, the UN has deployed through its initiatives more than 1 million men and women over 70 years to a large number of countries. If you break that down, it's about 14,000 per year. It is not clear if this particular document takes into account the Korean War or the first Gulf War. So we don't know about that. It has admittedly had some major failures, and those are listed there: the Rwanda genocide and the Srebrenica massacre that occurred in the Bosnian War in 1995. Under the UN Charter, the following issues are present, and then we will begin to have the dialogue that is pertinent to this court trial with these questions and others that will be addressed. The important part is that in signing the treaty to create the UN and participate in the UN, each article obligates member states to be subject to UN authority. I want you to keep that in mind. How does this affect state sovereignty? None of its members is elected directly by the people. So what borders exist to prevent the United Nations from being superior to sovereign states? Has their action in a number of different arenas been consistent with the Charter? Have they been successful? Where has it failed? This is the balance sheet. This is just another iteration of it, serving its purpose. Sovereign nations, viable. As a governing body, or merely, and sorry about an expensive platform for people to talk and gain all that little prestige that comes from being a participant, but in fact does nothing more than put a medal on your chest. The total budget is listed here, just under 4 billion. But as I mentioned in this particular thing, and this is one of the reasons this is a current events issue, is the U.S. has left several agencies, not just talked about leaving the UN entirely, but has actually withdrawn from certain agencies, as mentioned here, and has not participated in paying what it has been charged to pay as part of its funding. The budget for 2026 called for ending UN peacekeeping payments and pausing most other UN contributions. Now, some of you are grimacing, but remember, your actions here are to be as neutral as possible as you work through the realities of the trial being presented by the plaintiffs and offered by the defendants. If, on the other hand, your mind is already made up, you've got an hour and a half to go enjoy lunch and come back and vote. Right? Okay. I put up this political cartoon for the following reason. And again, the plaintiffs make the following argument. What has the UN done as an organization to end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? What has the UN done as an organization to end the misery in Gaza between Israel and the West Bank and Gaza together? What has the UN done about Iran? Has the UN done anything about North Korea? Just to list some examples. Has the UN stepped in to restrain the current administration of the United States, to prevent it from doing certain things which under its charter allegedly are not permitted? So having those questions in front of you, and as you may recall, if you attended the current events on Gaza, one of the stipulations was the creation of a board of peace, which was to control Gaza until the appropriate authorities could be put in place and function. And this was talked about actually just recently in I think a press conference. Now, lest we forget, we'll spend the last 5 minutes of the presentation on these highlighted principles that are taken from the United Nations Charter. Until you have these, everything I've said makes no real concrete sense. So what are they? Save generations from war. Reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. What are those? Who determines? If you have an interest in pursuing that, I recommend you come to the Lyceum that's going to be on the Declaration of Independence. Conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and international law can be maintained. Who determines international law? Who sets those standards? Why does the United Nations have any role in that whatsoever if international treaties are established elsewhere? Promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. What does that really mean? Does that mean that the wealth of the West must be distributed to those nations which lack that wealth, lack that development? And what does it mean to say larger freedom? Practice tolerance, live together in peace, unite our strength to maintain international peace, to ensure, critically, acceptance of principles and the institution of methods that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest. What is the common interest? Is that something that's present in Ukraine? Is that present in Gaza, where there are ongoing conflicts? And there are many others which I won't address. To employ international machinery for the promotion of economic and social advancement of all peoples, rather than leave this to sovereign nations to decide based on their national interests how they wish to spend their money in achieving those goals by supporting other nations with whom they feel a proper alignment. Having resolved to combine our efforts, we've agreed and established this international organization. The final approval was October 1945. Consider the date, consider the circumstances of the globe at the time, the enormous amount of destruction which had taken place throughout much of the world, and whether or not those particular stated goals are still achievable 70 plus 80 years later. Now, organizationally, you have the following. 41 organizations under the United Nations. These are not written directly into the charter, but like most government agencies have grown as the world has grown. So more and more initiatives, more and more organizations have been created to implement the goals outlined in the opening preamble and articles of the United Nations. 6 principal organizations, but look below, UN family of organizations linked with cooperative agreements. The IMF, World Bank, UNESCO, WHO, labor, intellectual property, meteorological information, industrial development, tourism. All of these things can be considered of global interest with a globally organized system to implement policies and procedures that have been developed by these organizations. Remember that every single one of these is not elected. They are appointed. 195 nations in the world, 193 in the UN, observer status, Vatican and Palestine, regions not recognized. Notice, nations expelled since its founding, none. Representation changes. China, you remember, was Taiwan initially because in 45 the nationalist Chinese were still in charge of mainland China. It wasn't until 1949 that the nationalists evacuated to Taiwan. South Africa was suspended and then Indonesia withdrew. But here's another point of great value to all of us. Given the current language used in our country, particularly in reference to our history, is slavery legal or illegal? Globally, it's considered illegal. But you read through authoritarian regimes, democratic but weak states, and what are called wealthy renter states, that they bring in what they call a contractual labor, but under the actual process, these people become slaves. And there are examples you can find if you look. I'm not going to charge any particular nation, but within the Gulf states, this is common. So, when you get to the Charter of the United Nations itself, as I outlined earlier in some of the preamble, you have these following issues that are in front of you. Friendly relations, international cooperation, without distinction to race, sex, language, religion, and whatever else one wants to throw in there anymore, and a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. In accordance with the following principles. Now notice this. Sovereign equality. want you to think about that for a minute. What does that really mean? When I gave the Gaza presentation, I talked about what is a sovereign state? What is it permitted to do? How is it organized? Because without understanding that fundamental, everything else goes away, is meaningless. Fulfill in good faith the obligations. Settle international disputes peacefully. Refrain from the threat of force. Well, that's gone by the wayside recently, hasn't it? Including our own country. Mm-hmm. Give the United Nations every assistance in any action it takes in accordance with the present charter. Now think about what that really means. All those other countries that are part of the National Assembly and members of the Security Council can obligate everyone to render assistance when the United Nations has determined that to be necessary. Has that ever occurred? And I think the historical record will say no. Refrain from giving assistance to any state in which the United Nations is taking enforcement action. As I mentioned in an earlier slide, there were certain sanctions and things which could be levied in order to make a member of the United Nations compliant, if you will. This is the punishment. This is the action we desire. And straight outside that boundary, here's the punishment. Get back on track. Does that work? Do other nations give assistance to nations which have breached the charter? China assists Russia, as an example, right? So you have all these different elements in play where none of that actually has happened. Ensure that states not members act in accordance with these principles. There's the steel inside the velvet glove. Nothing shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. So if, for example, a state determines that it wants to eliminate in its entirety a minority population, the United Nations is saying we have no jurisdiction nor any role in that. And yet other parts of their document say otherwise. So there is a paradox and a conflict. Principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement actions under Chapter 7. We're not going to go there unless you have great questions. Now, I'm going to stop here because this gets into the various articles, and I can reference them as we need. But now, I call upon the plaintiff counsel to call witnesses to outline the support for the affirmation that the United Nations disappear, and if it is to retain any form, that it be removed from New York City. Do we have a witness? Anyone willing to speak to that end? Okay. The defendant, listening to the charges laid against it, call on witnesses to defend the institution. Who shall speak to that matter? Robert?
I would like to make 2 points.
Okay.
In the second slide you showed, which had to do with the weaknesses of the United Nations as a deliberative body, you could insert Congress or Wait a minute, let me finish.
No,
Let me
steer
finish.
away from any.
This has nothing to do with Congress, but it has to do with the fact that all deliberative bodies seem to have weaknesses. And the second point would be that you have shown that the United Nations is not perfect, but perfect is often the opponent of good.
Both of those points I understand. First of all, I object to the reference to Congress because although you're using it as an adjectival development, it implies a criticism which is not pertinent to this discussion. I want to steer well away from anything that ties those things together. The second part is not an issue of perfection. It's an issue of whether or not it performs its duties, and even if it's doing it in a flawed manner, it is still worth preserving. That is the fundamental issue, not perfection. So that nothing is perfect. We'll accept that as a foundation. All right. Any others who wish to speak in the defense of the United Nations?
Well, elaborating on what you just said.
Make sure you speak loudly.
Elaborating on what you just said, I would say that getting some things done is sufficient to continue.
All right, well, give me just an example. These, again, are broad statements, but what we want is to identify something concrete and meaningful. So let me ask you this. All right, this is now, I'm giving this opportunity to the plaintiff attorney since none of you is willing to step up in support. And I can imagine where this jury is going to go very shortly. All right. Did the United Nations play, or does the United Nations play any role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
There's been some debate about it.
Well, that's not the point. The question is, you have to be specific. What, if anything, has the United Nations done as an organization, according to its charter, to bring peace to nations and reduce conflicts?
The point is that it has not done, has not stopped, has not caused to stop all conflict.
I never said all conflicts,
Well,
and
you're
I have
including
examples.
You're asking about Ukraine. It has not done much of anything about Ukraine.
Okay, very good. I appreciate that. That's an argument that the plaintiff's attorney will applaud. Yes,
Your Honor, we have someone online that would make a comment.
please. If
Hello.
you can't be, push your space bar.
Sorry, this is Robin on Zoom.
Speak louder.
This is Robin on Zoom, really? Can you hear me? I should note some partiality. I live 2 blocks from the UN. I don't care where it is, though. I would say that what they need is a constitutional convention to fix some of the well-known problems at the UN, such as Security Council size and vetoes, because it is far simpler to work with something existing than to create something from scratch.
Okay. So if I understand Robin correctly, I just want to make note that
Could you
you have to mute your audio. If I understand you correctly, the Security Council needs to be reformed, at least in terms of its authority. And if I understand correctly, that no single member, permanent or temporary, is allowed by itself to veto an action that would go against the majority will of the Security Council. Is that correct? Okay.
That is
Right.
one of the things I understand, yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Well, I would say that many of the points that the plaintiff brought up are quite accurate. To get rid of the UN without having any kind of replacement for it would still leave a void. And I would say that while it still is constituted, if it can reform itself and make changes so that it is more effective and figure out a method of enforcing its decisions or edict, that would be better. Otherwise, before it is disbanded, I think we need something else because otherwise there's nothing to maintain the world order.
Okay, let me again flesh out a little bit of what you've said. When we use the word enforcement, within the articles, and I could bring them up if it's needed, because I have them in here. There are certain actions that member nations are supposed to take. I alluded to one of them earlier in terms of decisions of the United Nations against a member state and even a non-member state, which has breached the principles outlined, are to be executed against that nation. So when you talk about enforcement, how do you force member nations to do that? When in their particular perspective, and I'll use the China-Russia connection in the Ukraine conflict, when a sovereign nation says, the heck with that, what are you going to do to me? Are you going to add me to your list of sanctions? Are you going to use military force? What is going to be the action you take? And if you're looking at military force, who has the military strength to enforce it? What nation or nations have the strength to enforce, let's say, and I'm using a wild example, that you want to prevent China from assisting Russia? Where does your force come from?
I want them to figure that out.
You see, and I'm not making fun of you at all. The purpose of this kind of discussion is because we often, and I do this, all right, so I'm not exempting myself at all. We often put out broad narratives, and then we fail to drill down into the reality of making that broad initiative, that broad concept, real. How do we actually do it? So in this sense, when, again, and I'm not criticizing you at all because I've been down the same road myself in my own work, is to say, who's going to make those decisions? For example, in the United States, whatever the flaws of our system, we do have elections. And those elections are to represent the will of the people. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not going down that road. I'm using it as an example. Is that true in China? Is that true in Russia? Is that true in Iraq? Is that true in North Korea? In other words, we could go through a huge number of countries and find that the people have no voice whatsoever in the decisions their governments make. So when we talk about giving the United Nations, which has no elected representatives by the people of the world, but only selected representatives sent there by every sovereign state, then the issue is that those individuals are going to represent their national interests as they pertain to functions of the United Nations. George?
I don't know if it could be considered a point of order, but you're trying to impose ideas of democracy on the member states of the United Nations.
Go ahead.
Many of the members of the United Nations are monarchies. Some are absolute, some are constitutional. Anybody idea how many monarchies there are in the world today? Thank you, Google. 43.
Now, George, you make
Most of them are members of the UN. One which is not the Vatican.
right. And one of the things I want to point out, and it was in an earlier slide, is that it said the peoples, not the nations. And that's why I drew the distinction. But you're absolutely right that, in fact, a great many countries operate according to a monarchy or a political party that essentially is the aristocracy / monarchy of that country. Yes.
And that was true from the very beginning,
When you say from the very beginning, you're referring to when?
1945.
Okay. No disagreement with that as a historical perspective. But remember what the charter said, what the preamble said. So we're looking at a disconnect. And I'm okay with that. That's the reality. But when we talk about enforcement, when we talk about obligating nation states to adhere to decisions made by the United Nations, then the question is, who is responsible for enforcement? The member states. But what do the member states represent? The national interests of each individual country that is a participant in the UN. And if they deem their national interests abrogated by a decision of the United Nations, then even in the charter, those nations are allowed not to participate. And yet you have the paradox of saying you're required to participate. So how can an organization function that has such internal paradoxes? Yes.
I would argue that it does seem to function. I look at October 1945.
Yes.
Over the past 30 years, there have been two cataclysmic wars in which between 100 and 110 million people have lost their lives, military and civilian.
All right. Just say what they are so that people here understand your reference.
World War I and World War II.
No, you said since 1945.
No, up to before
Oh,
1945.
Okay.
There were 100 million to 110 million
Right.
people who lost their lives.
Right.
In 1945, a group of people came together and said, this species has got to stop.
Right.
We are going to try to do something. And I would submit that in the 80 intervening years since 1945 October, that we have not had a cataclysmic conflict. We have had some limited outbreaks and we have had some persecutions, but we have never had anything on the scale of WW1 or WW2. So I would argue that there has been a success due to the existence of the United Nations, and we should look at the pudding not in terms of its individual ingredients, but how it has benefited the overall globe.
Okay. Now, since we don't, are you going to go ahead, Greg? Go ahead, Steve.
I want to ask you.
Oh, all right. Well, hold the question for a moment.
This pertains to
Oh, then go ahead.
Does coincidence mean causality? Has that been true because the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, and with nuclear weapons in the hands of multiple countries, is that what the restraining situation is, or does it have something to do with this UN, which doesn't seem to have much influence at all?
That's an excellent point to raise. I'm not going to answer that since that comes to individual interpretation. But I'm going to go back to something Robert said. And I'm going to list this example. And we have some people who have been, I'll call it on site when some of these things have happened. After the Communist Chinese Party took over mainland China, Do you have any idea how many people starve to death as a result of policies initiated by the central government? And this is also tied into the so-called cultural revolution. Now, that can be all argued that it's all domestic. Fine and dandy. If you want to take that approach, that's fine. But if you look up the numbers, you'll find a scale that is unconscionable. We also can look at the genocide that occurred in Rwanda between the Tutsi and the Hutu, and the thousands upon thousands of people murdered. We can look now at Niger and Nigeria, which are suffering under assault from
Sudan.
jihadist Islamic groups. Sudan, Darfur, another example. The current civil war in Syria. So the examples exist throughout the world. Look at what happened in India in 1948 when it broke up into East and West Pakistan and the current country of India. You can look at that and see what the losses were that took place. Now, as a more recent example and a simple example, and one that's perhaps a little too close to home for me, is the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where the Armenian population in Artsakh was expelled, 100,000 picked out, and their culture there essentially systemically destroyed. So in those regards, I have seen nothing that the United Nations has done in any of those conflicts that deserve the kind of recognition that the United Nations attributes to itself. Now, that's the plaintiff approach. You guys have forced me to be the plaintiff because none of you is willing to step up. And I get it. Remember, you're going to judge how this fleshes out. So let's take a break, 5 minutes. If you wish to have a sidebar here with the court, you're willing to come up. I will try to find someone on the side of the plaintiff who can listen in on your discussion so we can have that fleshed out. All right? All right, we're adjourned for 10 minutes.
I know.
The Buddhism.
In other words, I really don't
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Now, was that in Iran or Iraq? Yes. Afghanistan. Okay, the Taliban blew them up.
And nobody stopped them. Nobody cared.
Nobody cared. Right. They were 1,000 years old plus.
Nobody cared.
Right.
And you knew what was going. You knew what was going. I don't know.
Oh yeah, they knew it. They said they were. I mean, that's their ethos. I won't ask you to come up
As judge if you're wearing a bathrobe.
This is the closest I've come to a black robe. It's always good to see
Happy
you.
New Year, my man.
Happy New Year indeed. I'll see you next week at the retired professors. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Thank you for coming. I'm limited. Well, I don't have a black curtain I could put on tux, but that would have been offensive. So what can I tell you? At least it's a robe.
Is there such a thing as you were peacekeeping force?
Yes, but it's not organized except as ad hoc. So in other words, there's no standard. They have to go to member nations as per participants. So consider the following peacekeeping. And I mentioned in one of the slides. We go back to 1973. There were peacekeeping forces in Israel and the southern Iraq. What happened? Nasser basically said, yeah, you're going to be in the middle of something you don't want to be. We had a family member who was in Bosnia, and the rules of engagement were very, very different. If you were there in Somalia, Somalia is another example, where the UN peacekeepers were there, but basically trying to replace so the inverted Black Hawk down, and in that regard, there was a Pakistani example that was being bombed that was called upon to assist the Americans in the threat. And it took a good while for them to get permission to go assist the Americans. And by the time they got permission, most of the Americans were gone. So in terms of Black becomes extraordinarily. There's a whole other series of shows called The Siege of Jericho, which is where a small Irish group is put in base in order to reduce the conflicts that were taking nearby, and they got attacked by other forces. Fortunately, successful. But the point was, they were stuck and they were almost overrun. They were fortunate to survive. So, in terms of that respect to the question, who's your action force that's going to have I would support that with totally limited number of peacekeepers during the independence. Yeah, you want to go by.
I was going to just all kinds of everybody. Because then they get
what they do right now, which is all of the diplomacy that goes on all around the world. Yes,
it was
national security and national sovereignty trumps everything else. There isn't a country that functions without its national interest first in line. Well, they don't. But the question is, all right. Look at the League of Nations. Use that as another example. What happened to the League of Nations? No. What happened that really led to the
I didn't get any warning that it
Mussolini intends to do Haile Selassie goes to the League of Nations and says, what are you going to do about this? And look at some of the internal history. There were discussions like sanctions against Italy, none of which happened because Italy was considered a close power. And finally, Italy says,
well, exactly. But I but it was that is the exception.
Nation A and
as Robert pointed out, the more people involved in the discussion, the less likely you're going to find a solution because they're individual interests. So if, on the other hand, you conduct diplomacy and embassies, you figure out who the players are who have a real interest.
So I
Now, we're going to discuss this a bit more forcefully under the date of
Going back to your question.
Really, I mean,
So tell me what the trigger
but I think that's
All
what
right,
you're
well, then
talking
let's move
about.
it to let them spend $80,000 talking.
I guess the problem.
Because that's what they do anyway. Yes. All right, so that would be a change in the charter. And then say it's majority by the Security Council. But what about the national, the assembly? If the assembly has 190 seats, are you going to tell them that the Security Council won't make the
They're getting anyone.
Oh, okay. So within that framework, budgets will talk about other situations. The United States economy and military power, the second. So does, right, let me just finish this question. Does a country like Liberia have the same power within the assembly as the United States? Well, there should be one just there. It should be Now, that's a fascinating idea, truly, because Jefferson talked about that in the development of the Constitution. He was talking about land owners having a real stake in the country's future, whereas wage earners alone who have no profit have nothing else to worry about. They're not tied in. So it's an interesting philosophy. So from that standpoint, using the wealth position, you would grant the United States between 22 and 21. No nation would be without one vote, despite, even if it's a true gospel. As a number of nations contribute. It's like our idea of representatives, according to population, as opposed to representatives. That's intriguing.
As I was thinking, as I watched it, I thought it should be. Yeah, that's the right way to
No questions. Okay.
I do know what it is. I know. Yes, no, I'm saying. But anyway, you're right. Yeah.
And someone thinking that Joe Stalin's going to begin with the floor.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, but they should not have a security council. I think if you really live and we're starting to. I mean, the more I feel like
Court is back in session. Please be seated.
So the person on Zoom back a quarter of, she suggested that if, I'm paraphrasing obviously here, if there's any misstep, they lose their position in the Security Council and other agencies until resolved. You add, I think it is after your question, Barbara. And Rob, she doesn't want to talk because the vibration from her phone. But she's saying they lose their position on Security Council and other agencies until resolved.
The answer is no. And that is because
Check your mic.
No, it should be on.
Is it on or not?
I hear you. I think
You
it's
can
on.
hear it? I'll just talk a little louder.
We'll move it closer.
Here?
Yeah.
Here? Does it make any difference?
We can hear you.
Okay, all right. Under the current organization of the United Nations, the interesting, again, paradox is that the Security Council permanent members have absolute authority. Now consider that for a minute. No matter what change you want to bring to the United Nations, and there were some great suggestions that occurred at the sidebar, truly. What does it take to reform the United Nations? And where can that process be stopped, especially if one of the permanent members decides it is against their particular interests? So that raises an interesting problem. It's a little bit like saying, I don't like the king, so I want him to resign. Okay? And then we'll have another king imbued with the same power. But how do I get rid of that other guy? Well, history tells us the way you get rid of him is you kill him. All right. Or you rebel against the monarchy and you separate yourself politically into an independent nation. So from that perspective, is it reformable? Becomes the other question. Can you actually alter the United Nations in a profound way that takes away this monarchical or oligarchical control? I'm not aware of it, but I'm willing to hear anyone as a defendant of the UN try to answer that question. Okay, that's one for the plaintiff side. Again, remember, I have to take the plaintiff side, otherwise you're only going to hear one set of conversations. And, in a private conversation, it goes in different directions according to different things. I'm going to emphasize something that I alluded to in the first hour, and that was the WHO. It's not part of the UN. For a long time, I thought it was, as was UNESCO, or the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank. I thought those were all part, but they're not. They are surrogates, and they use the imprimatur of the UN to improve their cachet in the world. But they run their own organizations the way they wish. They're not dependent upon the UN particularly. During the COVID experience, again, I'm going to go through what I consider to be the facts without trying to make judgments. That when the COVID pandemic began, and you can look it up, the head of WHO commended China on how well it was addressing the pandemic. Now, if you read what actually happened in China during the pandemic, you come to a slightly different conclusion. People literally could not leave their apartments. They had to carry with them a special pass if they were to be out to go get groceries and return. They weren't allowed to go anywhere else. There were instances in which people were welded into their apartments. Now, you can say that's all fabrication. I'm just telling you what's been out there. They killed dogs. Not quite sure why, but that was part of it.
We do that here.
And they denied that the pandemic, absolutely denied that it had anything to do with the Wuhan lab. Now, whether you agree with that or not is not the point. But the head of WHO also said, as his authority as an unelected official in charge of what appeared to be a very powerful organization, that the mandates of wearing a mask were important to be exercised throughout the world. And secondly, that the pandemic began, stated this categorically, began in a wet market, not in a lab. Now, the last administration offered amendments, one of which I alluded to. Our administration offered this amendment, that the definition of a pandemic would be left to the head of WHO. That could include climate. Interesting. That any treatments developed in any country, and we know who those countries most likely were going to be, any treatments would not be patent protected, but actually had to be shared to all the other nations and assisted in developing the industrial capacity to produce the treatments, or if unable to do that, that the treatments created, let's say here in the United States, would be proportioned out to the rest of the world in an equitable fashion. In other words, whatever was happening here in the United States could not be used exclusively to assist the citizens of the United States. And now think of how that drills down. Company creates a product, it's not patent protected, they have to distribute the intellectual property, they have to assist in competitive manufacturing elsewhere, and who among us is going to decide who gets the treatment and who doesn't? So these are the realities of having a global organization with which is to be attributed the power to enforce these particular actions. And that raises a whole set of issues. Yes?
And the implication of what you said at the beginning was that the measures taken by the Chinese government, the lockdowns and so forth and so on, did not prevent the spread of the disease?
That is correct. In fact, even though China had recognized the problem with COVID and they were shutting down things within the country, they were still allowing people to get on airplanes and fly throughout the world.
And how many people in China died?
How many subsequently died? I don't have numbers, and part of the reason I don't have numbers is this. China has notoriously never revealed what's really going on in the country. Now, that's true of their emphasis on their GDP, for example. Just as an example. It's unclear that China even knows what their population is. George, you talked about that with me. Speak to it.
The Chinese demographic?
Yes. And why the numbers are so suspect.
This is kind of off topic from the UN. You really want to get into that now? But
Just as a quick aside as to the issue of how sovereign nations construct a narrative which is designed to promote their national interest.
well, it's more of an internal problem. There's regional rivalries within China that, and just like here, perhaps you might think about competing for federal dollars by reporting a larger population than you really have.
Right.
And at all levels, all of a sudden you have those cities to provide for people that never existed.
Right.
Never did.
So that is a summary, which is an appropriate thing to keep in mind, because if the information that is coming to the UN or to the world at large by whatever other means is perverted, then how do you make decisions based on that? This is the ultimate issue of skepticism, but we do acknowledge that some countries are less forthcoming with information than others. Yes.
The point I was getting to is that you don't know how many people were killed or died in China as a result of the disease in
Right.
proportion to the population. And your implicit criticism of what the head of WHO said is you don't know whether that's accurate or not.
No, we don't. But what we do know is when we look at our own response and what we did in this country and in other countries, particularly in Western Europe. Let me finish because you asked me the question. If we implemented, as we did, very similar requirements among our people, we have much better data. Now, just yesterday, I was speaking with a coroner. Not because I was dying, but because he was wondering if I was still alive. But the point was this, during the COVID time, he said that he was basically pressured that if someone had a positive COVID test, regardless of other circumstances, they were to list that as the cause of death. Now, we know from studies that have been done since then that that was a complete perversion of how many people actually died because they had COVID. And then we began to break down in scientific studies what we call comorbidities, so that COVID might have contributed. But to make an egregious example, you're in a car accident, you're killed, and then you're tested positive because of the way they handled things when you're brought into the emergency room and then to the morgue, found to be COVID positive. List COVID as your cause of death? Well, you can manufacture a thought process. Maybe you got in your brain and you lost control and that's why you had the accident. I mean, yeah, we can do that if you want to play those games. Yes.
I'd like to get back to the WHO.
Sure.
And I think its record in addressing the AIDS pandemic was significantly better than its record in dealing with COVID. And you shouldn't just look at one issue, but you should look at the aggregate of what they've done. And I think they were supremely effective in addressing AIDS.
And I can appreciate that. And my point is not perfection.
And the second point is all this research that the drug companies have done to develop vaccines was funded by the NIH and was done in universities. So the drug companies have taken the results of significant amount of government investment in university research and figured out a way of putting it together and manufacturing it. So it isn't all their accomplishments that we're talking about sharing. It's just the accomplishment in manufacturing.
Okay. I'm not
You
sure.
were talking about
Robert, I hear you, but let me give someone else a chance to talk. But I'm not sure I follow the logic entirely. I'm not going to try to address that. That becomes a dialogue between us, which is not what this is about. Someone else have another comment? Doesn't have to be about WHO. It can be about any of the issue.
What about, you're talking about maybe some problems they had during COVID. How about talking about overwhelming success? Smallpox? Anybody ever meet anyone that had smallpox? No. World Health Organization was largely responsible for eradicating the disease that probably killed more humans than any in history.
And I can appreciate that. Remember, I'm only trying to play the plaintiff side because I'm not hearing anybody trying to dismantle the UN.
Polio. Anyone seen polio? Well, observation hasn't gotten rid of it entirely, but largely.
Right.
And malaria.
And I don't know the structure through which smallpox, polio, and malaria have been addressed. Same as with tuberculosis, which used to be a scourge of the entire world, or getting rid of the Black Plague and things of that sort. Yes. No, they're talking about local administration.
I'm talking about public health administration that could be in the United States, it could be whatever is similar to that in other countries. So it has to do with immunization.
Yes, I understand your point. I just want to make clear in my own understanding that your reference is not specifically to WHO, unless WHO is the vehicle through which other public health administrations are given information. Is that what you mean? Or rather that our public health administration shares information with other nations?
When I worked in public health, we used to get a monthly report of all the infections in the United States and all the other countries.
Right.
And so information would be shared from country to country, what worked and what didn't work. That particular bulletin is no longer produced.
Okay. Wow. Which is a deficiency among nations or a deficiency of...
Our United States public health didn't eliminate.
Right. So in terms of relation to the WHO, if our organization of public health no longer disseminates information to other nations, you and I can absolutely agree that seems dumb at the very least, if not perverse in another way. I don't want to quite go down that path, but rather go back to the purpose and function of the UN. Now, in terms of itself, remember, WHO is a surrogate. It's not part of the UN. Making the UN go away does not mean WHO goes away. It doesn't mean the International Monetary Fund goes away. It doesn't mean that the World Bank goes away. They're independent. So we need to get back, and I'm sorry because I'm responsible for the strain here, is the UN. Think about the charter, the information that I've given you about how it is to address problems, and if it is performing its duties in a fashion which is universally at least acceptable, even if not perfect. So here, just as another example, initiate studies, make recommendations. International cooperation, progressive development of international law, cooperation in these various areas, realization, as we've talked about, of human rights and fundamental freedoms, whatever that means. Are those Western values alone? Because it was Western countries that organized the UN.
China was there.
But that was nationalist China. And that had a different relationship compared to the CCP alone. The Security Council, we talked about briefly, 10 members who will be non-permanent, equitable geographical distribution, 2 years, retiring member not eligible for re-election, and each member of the Security Council shall have 1 representative. But of course, the permanent members are the ones with veto power. The primary responsibility rests with the Security Council. Accept and carry out decisions of the Security Council and the assistance of a military staff. There is no armed force that is designated specifically as a United Nations armed service. All of the armed actions are relegated to individual nations, and generally they're voluntary participation. I can think of no member state in any of the conflicts that I've looked at where the UN participation required a large proportion of its assembly members to participate. Even in something as massive as the Korean War, the vast majority of members of the United Nations did not participate. Security Council will decide what measures are to be employed, and if they're inadequate, may take such action to maintain and restore international peace. Again, think about where this has happened or not happened. All members will make armed forces assistance and facilities available. No, doesn't happen. Members shall hold immediately available, my emphasis, National Air Force contingents. Not happening. Military staff shall consist of the chiefs of staff of the permanent members. Any member not permanently represented shall be invited when the discharge of responsibilities requires it. It's an interesting nuance. Are you required as a non-permanent member? Well, not really, so we don't have to listen to it. Interesting. These are the kinds of standards the United Nations has emphasized that are separate from simply maintaining the peace. Now, we talked earlier, and some of you commented upon how the United Nations was designed to prevent the kinds of conflicts the world had witnessed, specifically through Worlds I and II. And that indeed is the truth, as emphasized by Roosevelt and others who helped design the United Nations structure. This is another set of principles which goes beyond preventing disruption of the peace. But this is incorporated into the Charter. So suddenly you see this enormous expansion. But again, with a lot of vague things put in it. Higher standard of living. Well, if you read reports on people who were in Afghanistan during our recent 10-year foray into that poor nation, you realize that many of those people lived in what we would consider in our country abysmal poverty. But they lived that way for generations. They adapted to their environment and to their culture and to their religion. So who's to come in and say, we're going to make your standard of living better? What? Where does that come from? Who gives you the right to try to change what I do and what my family for generations has done? If you want another example, and again, I'm going to make a self-reference, but I do that all the time. Anyway, that's what you guys have to live with. When I gave my lectures on American colonial history and the French and Indian Wars, one of the things I pointed out was how different the cultures, economies, and spiritual nature of Native Americans were compared to the incoming European immigrants, be they British, Dutch, French, or Spanish. Extraordinarily different, worlds apart. And the conflicts that resulted from that, at least in part, were based on those enormous differences. Plus, the enormous technological advantages that accrued to the Europeans who were coming to North America. In a situation like this, is it possible, feasible, even desirable to have the United Nations decide that you need a higher standard of living? What does full employment mean? How do you address that? How do you determine solutions to human rights and fundamental freedoms within a state? Yes.
I think there's a problem with the word promote.
Okay.
We're talking about promoting something. We're not talking about creating something.
Okay.
And I think that the promotion is a very different concept than to talk about we're going to create full employment, we're going to create a higher standard of living.
Right.
I think it's entirely up to individual countries to decide if they want any change or any improvement, and we would try to, the UN should try to facilitate that if the United Nations decided to do so. And that would be promote.
I think that's an excellent point, and I do, when I create these slides, not copy and paste directly from the charter into this slide. I finesse it a little bit.
I don't think you're responsible.
I'm always, except for my sources. The fault lies with my sources. But you do highlight an important element that is the plaintiff's approach. A sovereign nation gets to decide what's in its best interests of, what its national interests are, what its national security is. And short of being forced through economic or military activities to comply with the will of another, the United Nations is supposed to allow you that sovereignty and not compel. And yet at different times, we've talked about compelling. Indeed, within the charter itself, it talks about using force, economic and military. So this is where part of the issue is, and whether this organization is really designed to deal with that or not. Yes.
Just a question. Does our president have the authority to withdraw from the UN?
Yes.
Actually, the UN documents don't have any method of exiting membership. It's only attempted once by Indonesia because they had conflict in Malaysia, and they kind of pulled out for a year, and then they got back in. Nobody said anything about it. There's no exit mechanism.
And I'm glad you said that. I did not look into that part. There was nothing within the charter that grants you that authority. And by analogy, it's a little bit like the position of the federal government at the breakup of, or start of our Civil War, where classifying the Confederacy as a separate nation was off the table. You could not separate from the Union. So it had to become a rebellion.
But isn't he saying that withdrawing funds or not paying funds?
Yes, and that's another way of deflating your influence and place. And it's possible, though again, if you think about the authority of the Security Council, for the United States to be expelled. And again, there's documents within here about how that expulsion occurs, but I did not put it into our slides. Yes.
You say that the withholding of funds might deflate the United States into the fact that might inflate the United States influence in order to try to get the funds back.
I think that's an excellent point. That would be a political ploy on the part of any administration that wants to do that. Some of the funding for the surrogate organizations, I think, lie within the authority of the executive branch because it falls under foreign policy. But in terms of the UN, I don't know enough about that. Yes.
I checked to see when before it was the Senate that we are going to be using the ultimately required Senate to
Okay.
but that changed.
Right. The world is hardly normal these days. We all can agree on that. Yes,
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there have been a number of times when the United States has not paid our money to the UN for multiple years in a row.
right. That is true, and it's also true of the surrogate organizations. It's very important to separate the two out.
I'm just curious if you get kicked out.
Yes,
Okay?
yes.
Unless we
The
beat it.
problem there is that the Security Council may, and again, I didn't get into this because I hadn't anticipated it, frankly. Whether the Security Council can veto the action to expel a member, which would be an interesting problem, because if you try to expel the United States and we're on the Security Council and say, nah, not happening.
Or in our country, too.
Yes. Go ahead,
With a
Joan.
big, huge building.
Yeah, from the audience, didn't the U.S. just quit the World Health Organization? It's a question.
Yes, but that's because it is not part of the UN. So we can do that under the authority granted to the executive branch in conducting foreign policy, because that is a foreign policy issue. It's not a budget issue, so it doesn't go to Congress, although Congress might challenge it, depending upon their power of the purse and how that fleshes out. Right now, that's a big mess for the Supreme Court to address. And I have no idea how that's going to play out. Yes.
You assume that you assume that if the United Nations as a body wanted to expel the United States, that the United States could veto that, it wouldn't, and that it would. And this administration, I suggest that if that happens, it might not veto it.
Again, this is speculation. I have no idea how that would work in reality, so I can't go down that path. But it's certainly possible, I would imagine, that some country, any country, just says, you know what? The heck with all of you. I'm not paying dues. I'm not sending an ambassador. I'm not showing up. So even though I'm still legally a member, you can't compel me to provide representation or funds. I'm not going to do it. Again, state sovereignty. Who gets to decide that? Let me just make following notes, just so you can take a little point here. Article 92, the International Court of Justice shall be the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. All members are ipso facto parties to the statutes of the International Court of Justice. Now think about that for a moment. What laws does the International Court of Justice rely upon in order to render a decision? Who created those laws? How are they being assigned to the International Court of Justice? And who among the justices is chosen or selected by what body to engage in a court trial? Who has that authority? Where does the limit get drawn? It might be that international treaties, like the laws of the sea, right? International laws of the sea represent a body of work signed by a large number of countries, and that treaty is given to the International Court of Justice to decide if something is going to happen or not. Now, let me give you a real example, and I apologize if I have this wrong. The Philippines laid a claim against China, saying that certain islands, and I use that word in quotation marks, within the South China Sea did not belong to China, and therefore China had no authority to build on those islands. The International Court of Justice said, Philippines wins. You've won your case. What did China do? Did it withdraw? No. It said, I don't care what you said. I'm staying. Try to kick me out. There's no enforcement. Philippines certainly can't confront the Chinese Navy. Completely inadequate. You want the United States, Germany, France. France at least has some blue water capable ships. England, yeah, I know they're marginal, but they're there. To somehow go and enforce the decision of the International Court of Justice? Is that even going to happen? The answer, of course, is no. So, what value does it really have? Now, if you want to grab a guy like Milosevic and try him for genocide, well, one guy, who's going to stand up for him? That guy we can crush. But an independent nation? And there have been other allegations targeting military forces based in other countries and things of this sort, which have gotten into a whole soup of misery. So I bring those points out because that is within the authority of the United Nations. Article 104 shall enjoy in the territory, read this very carefully, such legal capacity as may be necessary for the exercise of its functions and the fulfillment of its purposes. The organization shall enjoy in the territory, the organization, the UN, as may be necessary for the exercise of its functions and the fulfillment of its purposes. This is global government. Your sovereign nation, allegedly under Article 104, is obligated to comply. Does that still serve a purpose? Is this something that the United Nations can say, but has no intrinsic value? It's just words. Or, if you subscribe to it, if you believe that what the United Nations is doing in its charter is important enough that there should be enforcement, then that takes us to a whole different step. Okay? So, arguments for the dissolution. We're going to come to a jury vote very shortly. It's just too expensive for what it accomplishes. It can't even meet its own goals. It truly threatens state sovereignty. It costs the city and state of New York an enormous amount of money. If you were to sell off that property and develop it and make it taxable, the amount of money that would accrue to the city and state of New York and possibly to the federal government would be enormous and easily pay itself off, especially consider the contribution of the United States to keep the UN functioning.
Who actually owns the property?
The UN.
So why would the state of New York and New York City get the proceeds from selling it?
No, they wouldn't get the proceeds from selling it. The point is that if the UN's kicked out, that property would revert back to the state. Think of it as eminent domain. And then you say, guess what? Someone out there had a comment?
Wouldn't we have to buy it?
We might. And let's consider that in that one of the early slides, I said that the total value of that property, which given Manhattan, given the location and so on, is probably in the order of $6 billion. With developers there, with the taxes, rents, all the other things that would accrue to making that a productive area with taxes flowing to the city and state of New York and the federal government, it'd be cheap. It would be cheap. So, international activities managed through other agencies. We've already talked about that. It's expanded its authority beyond its charter. It's delving into things where you could raise real questions about what it's doing. It's too political, and I mentioned that in terms of how the Assembly has passed resolutions condemning various countries and not calling out others who are at least equally, if not worse, perpetrators of great difficulty within their own people and others. And unelected officials wielding power without restraint. The only restraint is a sovereign nation saying, I'm not doing it. On the other hand, grievances can be aired among a lot of people all at once. Everyone can hear it. And a lot of different resolutions can be reached. But let me take a couple quick examples. The recent conflict between India and Pakistan. I don't know if any of you paid much attention to that particular set of problems, but it was getting real bad. And the threats back and forth between Pakistan and India, both of which are nuclear powers, got to the point where there was real concern that a flat-out war could occur. Maybe not with the exchange of nuclear weapons, but not saying that wouldn't happen. Did the UN stop it? Look at Thailand and Cambodia. They were coming to blows. They've suffered with each other for decades over their border. They were close to open conflict. Did the UN stop it? Okay. The UN, in fact, had nothing to do with it. Just as it had nothing to do with Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Gaza, or Niger and Nigeria, and Sudan, and on and on and on. Standardizes certain policies, okay. Try this in your country, try that in your country. But the same policies in California work. I won't use New York because we are very similar. Do they work the same as in Texas? Of course not. Each gets to decide what's appropriate to its communities. How does standardization work when you deal with a global issue of countries that have such differences, not only in their ethnicities, in their culture, in their religions, in their economies, in their moral values? How do you do that? Peacekeeping forces, there have been some real successes, and there have been some egregious failures. Costs according to a nation's wealth seems very suitable in terms of the budgetary issues, but again, those nations may or may not contribute according to their own wish. Coordinated actions, except it never happens. A few countries will get together and support something like Korea, but on the whole, very few actually participate. And other organizations have been used in Africa, for example, to try to reduce as peacekeeping forces, but not under the UN authority, which again is a solution that has been looked at. Indirect investment in New York's economy and the location of the treaty. Yes.
I think you failed to list another charge, and that is that it potentially undermines the security of the United States, allowing all these foreigners in here with diplomatic immunity, and that they could increases the ability of other nations to spy on the United States.
Right. And a good example of that is less directed to your comment, so I'm buttressing your comment. Some of you may remember what happened in London with I think it was the Iranian embassy and the problems that occurred there, because embassies are supposed to be sovereign territory. But things were happening in such a way that I think the British government, and I can't remember whether they used local or military forces to actually attack the embassy and take it over. George, often you're more cognizant of those things, but if you don't remember, I'm only going to call you out for your ignorance.
Well, along that same point, as far as the problem in New York, is the fact that all you have all these international diplomats with diplomatic immunity.
Right.
And this is a real case situation. They drunk drive, they kill somebody, and prosecute.
Right. I mean, just parking tickets alone are estimated to cost New York literally millions of dollars. Just say, ain't gonna happen. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard from both sides. You are called upon as the jury to render a verdict. I realize the situation is complicated, but the ultimate issue before you is the following. Should the United Nations either be disbanded or excised from Manhattan and moved elsewhere, or should it retain its current structure and place in New York City? Those in favor of expelling NATO, the United Nations, NATO's the next target. I may not conduct it as a trial, but there we are. Those in favor of expelling or dissolving the UN, please designate by raising your hand. Okay. Anyone on Zoom raising their hand? At a bunch of them.
Oh, wait a minute. There is one is in favor.
Okay, we have 5 in favor. Those opposed? All right, thank you. The opposed wins. The United Nations retains its location and its function.
I was 2005.
Can't do that from a jury pool, but I know that you're not compensated for coming. In fact, you had to pay to come here. And
Tulsi Gabbard says the election was rigged.
there you are. Court is adjourned.
Keeping it in the United States, but moving it to a different location.
Within the United States?
Yes.
New York is so accessible with its air traffic and all the other sources of coming in.
Staying there and not thinking about moving anywhere else?
Right. Yeah, they don't want it in middle America. And certainly don't want to bring it to Brooklyn. Yes.
I don't know if you know this, but the United Nations had to put in a.
I'm up with ideas about how the world ought to be run or like country and not have plans to modify your concept. This is what I object to. I think the concept of the UN I completely agree with, but we don't have very good participation. And I think part of it is that there's profound flaws in what they're attempting to do or how they say they want to do things. And I can't understand why there isn't some, let's say every decade, a review of the principles and a modification is needed. We better get forward what we need. I also think this stuff about every intervention has to be a military intervention. I don't agree with that. It seems to me that the sanction that if you decided multiple nations said, you shall not buy the benefit from you, live on your own. I think that could have an impact.